They said, "We found you a nice facility, Mom." That was the first sentence that told me my life was being folded up like old linen and packed away. My daughter, Claire, said it with a smile so gentle it could bruise. She touched my wrist the way a nurse does before a needle. I remember the light on her face, calm, bright, practiced, and the way she avoided my eyes when she added, "You'll have your own room, a garden view. They even have art classes." I could hear the tremor under her tone, not of guilt, but of rehearsed compassion. The same voice she used when explaining to her children why the old cat had to be put to sleep. I didn't say a word. I just watched her lips move and thought, she's already decided where I will disappear. I'm 81. My name is Eleanor Pierce, retired English teacher, widow of a man who used to bring me coffee every morning until his heart stopped doing its work one spring. I live alone in the same house where we raised 2 children and buried 1 dog, where the paint on the windowsills still remembers my hands, where the lilac bush he planted the year we moved in still blooms without permission. I still make my own breakfast, still drive to the grocery store on Tuesdays, still write letters on real paper. But according to my daughter, I am too independent for my own good. According to her husband, Mark, my stairs are a liability. And according to the glossy brochure she slid across my table, my next address should be a beige complex with a pond. Perfect for reflection. Reflection, such a kind word for isolation. That morning, they arrived unannounced, like realtors on a deadline. Claire had a folder under her arm, and that efficient expression people wear when they think they're rescuing someone. "Don't get upset," she said, before I'd even offered coffee. "We've just been thinking about what's best for you." I remember the smell of her perfume, something citrusy, too sharp for the small kitchen, and how it made the air feel thinner. She sat where her father used to sit, legs crossed, fingers clasped neatly as if in prayer, and started talking about transitions. I didn't interrupt. I'd learned long ago that silence unsettles the self-assured more than argument. Mark kept pacing near the window, pretending to admire the garden. He said the roses looked wild, as if that were a flaw. "The place we found has beautiful landscaping," he offered, his voice full of bright vacancy. "They handle everything for you. Laundry, meals, maintenance. You won't have to worry anymore." Won't have to worry. I almost laughed. I've managed a mortgage, a classroom of 40 teenagers, a husband through cancer, and 2 children through their own storms. But now, apparently, folding laundry is beyond me. They spoke of the facility as if it were paradise. "You'll have people around, Mom," Claire said. "Your own community. It'll be fun." Fun. I imagined forced smiles, endless bingo, the hollow chatter of strangers who once had their own kitchens and gardens and lives before being shepherded into tidy little rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. I thought of the women I'd visited after retirement, former colleagues who once corrected essays and quoted Shakespeare, now sitting in identical armchairs watching silent televisions. Their lives had been reduced to schedules: breakfast at 8, pills at 9, memory exercises at 10. I wondered if Claire had ever visited a place like that, or if she'd just looked at the online photos, the ones where everyone is smiling over plastic teacups. As they spoke, I looked around my kitchen, at the stack of old recipe cards, the mismatched mugs, the dent in the table where my son dropped a hammer while fixing a toy 20 years ago. Everything in that room had a story, and every story had my fingerprints on it. Claire's voice kept drifting through the air, words like safety, peace of mind, professional care. I wanted to ask her if she thought peace could be found among strangers, or if safety was worth the price of belonging. But I didn't. Instead, I smoothed the edge of the tablecloth and said softly, "That's quite a lot to consider." She smiled, relieved, mistaking composure for agreement. After they left, I stood in the hallway and listened to the silence settle back into the house. It was a familiar quiet, not lonely, but alive. The sound of walls remembering laughter. I walked to the window and watched them pull away in their sleek car, my daughter checking her phone, her husband adjusting his sunglasses. They looked satisfied, as if they'd completed a moral errand. I stayed there until the car disappeared around the corner. Only then did I let my hand rest against the glass. The sun was sinking behind the lilac bush, and for a moment I thought of my husband, how he used to trim it too short every spring, how it always grew back defiant and full. That night, I found the brochure on the counter where she'd left it. The cover showed a silver-haired couple playing chess by a pond. The woman's smile was too broad, the man's eyes unfocused. Inside were phrases that sounded like eulogies. Comfortable aging, peaceful surroundings, personalized care for every stage. I read it twice, each sentence more insulting than the last, then folded it neatly and set it under the leg of the wobbling chair in the dining room. It did some good there, at least. Sleep didn't come easily. The wind rattled the gutters, and the old house creaked like it was warning me. I thought of the phrase Claire had used, "We found you a nice facility." Not, "You chose." Not, "We found a place together." But "We found you." The way you'd say it about a stray cat. I realized then that my daughter, whom I had nursed through scarlet fever and heartbreak, now spoke of me in the third person when I wasn't around. To her friends, I was Mom. A project, a burden wrapped in politeness. I turned on the lamp and looked around my bedroom. Bookshelves heavy with decades of reading, the quilt I'd sewn the year she was born, the photograph of my husband in his Navy uniform. I whispered into the stillness. Not yet. The next morning I made tea and toast, the way I always do, and wrote a list on the back of an envelope. Not a to-do list, but a to-remember list. My bank account numbers, the deed to the house, the location of the fireproof box under the bed. Then I added one more line. Find out what they signed without me. Because I could feel it in my bones, something had already been set in motion. The way they'd looked at each other, that little flicker of shared relief, told me the decision was final. My role now was to cooperate gracefully. But I have never been graceful about surrender. Later that day, I called the bank, then the insurance office, then the county records department. Each call another thread pulled from the web they thought they'd spun around me. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I just smiled at the polite voices on the other end of the line and asked the questions that mothers aren't supposed to ask. By noon, I knew enough to confirm my suspicion. Claire's name was already on one of my accounts, for convenience, as the manager put it. Convenience, the modern word for theft with paperwork. When evening came, I sat by the window with my tea and watched the neighborhood lights flicker on. Across the street, a young couple was arguing softly while carrying groceries inside. I envied them for their noise, their chaos, their unplanned life. I used to think aging meant rest, but it really means being slowly erased by people who claim to love you. I traced the rim of my cup and thought of the phrase again, tasting its insult like metal in my mouth. A nice facility. They might as well have said a soft place to disappear. That's when the decision began. Not loud, not sudden, but solid. I would let them believe their plan was working. I would smile and nod and let them schedule whatever meetings they needed. And while they congratulated themselves on their kindness, I would make my own arrangements. I had spent 40 years teaching young people how to find their voice in a world determined to silence them. I could find mine again. I had not survived grief, debt, and solitude, just to be tucked away like an unused piece of furniture. When the house finally grew dark, I went to my husband's old desk and opened the drawer where I kept our letters. The top one was from the first year of our marriage, his handwriting neat and certain. "You'll always make your own way, Ellie. You never did like cages." I smiled then, a small, dangerous smile. Claire thought she'd found me a cage with nice wallpaper. But she had forgotten who built this house, who signed every check, who balanced every account. She had forgotten that beneath the soft cardigan and quiet tone was a woman who once stood in front of a room full of teenagers and made them believe words could change the world. I looked around at the walls, at the life they held, and whispered to the empty air, "Let's see what lesson she learns next." The defining moment, the one that cut through every polite word and softened tone, came a week later on a Wednesday that smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant. Claire arrived unannounced again, which had become her way lately, a quiet invasion disguised as affection. She had a folder under her arm and an expression that was almost apologetic, but not quite. The kind of face you wear when you've already made peace with doing something unforgivable. Mark followed behind her, carrying himself like a man on official business rather than a son-in-law visiting family. They sat me down at the dining room table, the same table where I used to serve Sunday roast and birthday cakes, the same one that still bore the faint scratches from my children's school projects. Now, it had become a boardroom. Claire opened her folder, and inside was a stack of papers, thick enough to feel dangerous. "Mom," she said softly, "we just want you to look through this with us. No pressure, but it's time we plan ahead." I looked at the pages. Legal documents, release forms, medical directives, and something labeled power of attorney. The phrase itself carried a weight that felt like the edge of a lock clicking shut. I asked her what all this was for, and she reached across the table, placing her hand over mine in that careful, performative way people do when they're trying to preempt resistance. "It's just so we can help manage things, Mom," she said. "Bills, property, medication, nothing major. You know how confusing these things can get." She smiled again, a gentle flash of teeth that reminded me of how she used to smile before a lie when she was 12. Mark cleared his throat and began explaining something about asset protection, long-term care, tax advantages, and streamlining responsibilities. His voice had that patronizing firmness men often use with women they've decided can't understand. Numbers. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak. Let him drown in his own words, until he said the one phrase that confirmed everything I'd feared. "We've already made a down payment on the facility, just to hold your spot." I felt the room tilt slightly, though my body remained perfectly still. The tea in my cup trembled. My hands didn't. I asked very quietly if they'd used my account for that. Claire hesitated just a fraction too long, and that pause told me more than any explanation could. "It's just temporary," she said quickly. "You'll be reimbursed once everything's transferred properly. We didn't want to lose the reservation." Reservation. As if my home, my life, were a hotel room to be vacated. My heart thudded slowly, not from fear, but from the clarity of realization. They had moved money, made arrangements, spoken to strangers about my future without so much as a conversation. I stared at the neat columns of print on the documents, my name printed there in black ink under words like transfer, consent, and authorization. Each one felt like a small betrayal wrapped in bureaucracy. They must have mistaken my silence for confusion, because Claire leaned closer, her voice dripping with the syrup of concern. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're only thinking of your safety." That word again. Safety. I had taught hundreds of students to recognize euphemisms, and now here was my own daughter weaponizing one against me. Safety meant control. Safety meant confinement. Safety meant silence. I looked at her hands, manicured and trembling slightly, and wondered if she even realized that what she was doing wasn't care. It was erasure. "You'll love it there," she continued, pulling out a glossy brochure. "They have a piano room, a library, even art classes. You used to love painting." I hadn't picked up a brush in years, not since my husband's death, but the way she said it made it sound like a tranquilizer. She wanted to sedate my resistance with nostalgia. When I didn't respond, Mark spoke again, his tone firm and managerial. "We've scheduled a meeting with the facility director this Friday. They'll show you around. Just think of it as exploring options." I asked him, "And if I decide against it?" He smiled the way men do when they think they're being patient. "Well, it's already in motion. There's no harm in visiting." I wanted to laugh. No harm in visiting? The same phrase people use when introducing children to the dentist. I realized then that they had already written the story of my disappearance and were now merely rehearsing the lines with me. The next morning, I called my bank to confirm what I already suspected. There had been a withdrawal, marked Health Management Services, the same amount Claire mentioned. The woman on the phone spoke kindly, but with a cautious undertone, as if she'd been told not to alarm elderly clients. "It looks like a family-authorized transfer," she said. "Your daughter's name appears on the account as a joint holder." My chest tightened, not with panic, but with the cold recognition of how efficiently betrayal operates when it's disguised as love. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. I thought of Claire as a little girl, of the way she used to hold my hand when crossing streets, trusting me entirely to lead her safely. I had taught her to be careful, to plan, to think ahead. She had learned all those lessons well, perhaps too well. That Friday, I let them drive me to the facility. The car ride was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of Claire's phone, buzzing with messages she pretended not to read. The building sat on the outskirts of town, large and sterile, its facade painted in shades of optimism, beige and soft blue. The sign out front read, "Oakview Senior Living, where comfort meets community." I almost laughed at the absurdity of the slogan. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and lemon polish. A woman in a pastel uniform greeted us with rehearsed warmth and led us through gleaming hallways lined with paintings of landscapes that didn't exist. In each room we passed, I saw faces, some hopeful, some vacant, all waiting. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was worse than cruelty. It was indifference in pastel colors. Claire kept talking, pointing out the amenities as if she were touring a luxury apartment. "Look, Mom, a garden. You can plant flowers. They even have a book club." Her voice echoed off the spotless walls, trying to fill the silence I refused to break. The facility director, a man with a smile too white to trust, asked if I had any medical conditions they should know about. Only a strong heart, I said, and a tendency to remember details. Claire gave a nervous laugh, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. I asked if residents could leave whenever they liked. Of course, the director said too quickly, with proper coordination. Coordination, another word for permission. When we left, Claire squeezed my arm gently. See? It's not so bad, she said, her tone bright with relief. I nodded, because there was nothing else to do. She mistook my stillness for surrender. But inside, something quiet and deliberate had begun to move, like a clock starting after years of neglect. I knew then that this was no misunderstanding, no misguided act of love. It was a coup, a quiet domestic one, carried out with the efficiency of paperwork and polite conversation. They wanted my home, my autonomy, my absence wrapped neatly in the language of care. That night, I walked through every room of my house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. The air felt heavier than usual, filled with a kind of farewell I wasn't ready to give. On my husband's old desk, I found a pen and a blank notebook. I wrote the date at the top of the first page and one sentence beneath it. They've decided my life is over, but they forgot to tell me I still get to choose the ending. Then I closed the book, turned off the light, and for the first time in years, I slept without fear. The days that followed blurred together like rain sliding down glass, each one carrying a dull weight that pressed harder on the edges of my calm. Claire began visiting with unsettling regularity, always unannounced, always at the same time of morning when I was still in my robe, the air thick with the smell of toast and old tea. She would bring new documents for me to glance over, and I would pretend to read them while quietly tracing the patterns of her handwriting where she'd added my name in the margins, as if rehearsing ownership. Each paper came with the same soft assurances, just formalities, just logistics, just what everyone does at your age. I nodded, smiled, set them aside, and later that night, when the house was wrapped in quiet, I'd take them to my husband's old desk and read them properly, line by line, each word a small erosion of my place in the world. The tone was never cruel. It was polite, bureaucratic, as if they were asking me to volunteer for my own disappearance. It's remarkable how efficiently one can be erased when the process is wrapped in concern. I began to notice small changes around the house, quiet rearrangements that at first seemed innocent. The mailbox now bore a shiny label that read C. Morgan E. Pierce. The names in that order. A new security company sign appeared in the yard, though I had not approved it. The utilities began arriving as digital statements instead of paper bills. Claire must have arranged that. For convenience. She used to call that phrase her father's favorite when she was a teenager, whenever she wanted an easier curfew or an allowance increase. Now it had turned into her mantra for power. Every system that once tethered my independence, bank, mail, property, identity, was being quietly rerouted through her fingertips, through her laptop, through passwords I hadn't been given. I would find her sitting at my dining table, typing briskly, eyes bright, saying things like, "Don't worry, I've already handled that," or, "You don't need to deal with these things anymore." There was affection in her voice, but the kind of affection people have for something they are phasing out. Neighbors began to notice her car parked in my driveway almost daily. One afternoon, my old friend Harriet stopped by with a pie and an uneasy smile. "Everything all right, Ellie?" she asked, standing in the doorway as if the threshold itself were dangerous. I wanted to say yes, to reassure her that everything was fine, but the lie caught somewhere behind my teeth. Claire appeared before I could answer, cheerful and firm, her arm sliding around my shoulders. "Mom's just adjusting to some new plans," she said. "We're simplifying things." Simplifying. Another euphemism. Harriet smiled uncertainly, handed me the pie, and left before her shoes could even gather dust on the mat. When I turned to look at Claire, she was already scrolling through her phone, as though the conversation hadn't happened. I set the pie down on the counter and thought of all the ways simplicity can resemble erasure. The following week, appraisers began to visit. I hadn't been told they were coming. The first one was a young man in a navy blazer who looked around with that detached curiosity of someone who values everything by square footage and resale potential. "Lovely bones," he said, tapping the wall as though feeling for hidden treasure. I asked him what exactly he was doing, and he explained, "Just a pre-market assessment, ma'am." I smiled thinly and said, "That's interesting, considering I haven't decided to sell." He looked confused, checked his clipboard, and mumbled that my daughter had already arranged everything. When he left, I closed the door gently, then locked it for the first time in years. It was around that time I began to feel the texture of loneliness change. It wasn't the kind that comes from being alone. It was the kind that grows when people surround you but refuse to see you. I still had my morning rituals, the tea, the radio murmuring news I barely listened to, but now they felt like rehearsals for invisibility. The phone rang often, but never for me. When I answered, the voices were businesslike: agents, insurance offices, doctors confirming appointments I hadn't scheduled. Every polite sentence was another nail, another piece of my life neatly filed under management. One afternoon, I overheard Claire on the phone in the next room saying, "Yes, she's comfortable with everything. It's just a matter of timing now." Comfortable. I almost admired the precision of her deceit. I tried once to confront her directly. I asked her to sit down. Told her I felt things were moving too fast, that I needed space to make my own decisions. She nodded sympathetically, then countered every word with gentle reason. "Mom, you're overthinking. I'm just trying to help. You've done enough. It's time to let go." She said it as though letting go were an act of grace, not surrender. I realized then that there was no argument to be won, no speech powerful enough to undo what she had already decided. She didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as responsible. That was the true danger, when harm believes it's doing good. At night, I started keeping notes. I wrote down dates, transactions, names, amounts. I documented everything, not because I thought anyone would read it, but because writing made me feel visible to myself. I found an old ledger from my teaching years, filled with lesson plans and attendance sheets, and used the blank spaces for these new lessons. Betrayal, I was discovering, has grammar. It begins with conjunctions. "I'm only doing this because," and ends with periods too final to argue. I kept the notebook hidden inside the hollow of an old dictionary, between mercy and miracle. That placement felt deliberate. One afternoon, I caught sight of a stranger walking around my garden, taking photos. When I went outside, he introduced himself as an agent, working with your daughter on preliminary listings. Listings. My garden, my trees, my memories, all reduced to bullet points on a sales pitch. The lilac bush by the porch was in bloom, thick and fragrant. He crouched to take a photo, commenting, "Buyers love mature landscaping." I wanted to tell him that bush was older than my marriage, that it had survived winters harsher than he could imagine. But instead, I just stood there, feeling the damp earth under my slippers, realizing that even the ground beneath me was being measured. Inside, I found a letter on the kitchen table, printed on heavy paper. A formal notice of property evaluation and transfer discussion, with my daughter listed as the primary contact. No one had bothered to ask for my signature yet. They assumed compliance would come naturally. I sat down and read it 3 times. Then calmly, I placed it beside my cup of tea and thought about the word home. I had spent years teaching my students that words gather meaning through context. The same is true of homes. A house is just wood and air until it holds the echoes of your life. And once someone decides those echoes are inconvenient, they become noise to be quieted. That night, I walked through each room again, but this time not in nostalgia, more like reconnaissance. I opened drawers, checked old boxes, found documents I'd forgotten existed. The original deed, tax receipts, a joint account letter from decades ago when my husband and I first applied for a mortgage. I gathered them all, placed them in a canvas bag, and hid it under the floorboard in the sewing room, the one place Claire never entered because of her allergy to dust. I worked slowly, methodically, the way I used to correct essays late into the night, careful not to make mistakes. When I finished, I stood in the dim light of the room and felt something sharp and electric move through me, a flicker of agency. They thought I was fading, but I was taking notes in the dark. A few days later, I pretended to misplace my checkbook. I wanted to see if she'd notice, if she'd panic. She didn't. She simply said, "It's fine, I'll order a new one," her tone brisk, practical, dismissive. I smiled and said thank you, then later found the checkbook exactly where I'd hidden it, untouched. That's when I knew I wasn't losing my mind. They were trying to make me believe I was. Each small intrusion became a rehearsal for my disappearance. The key they copied without asking. The boxes Claire began labeling "donate." The faint scent of lemon cleaner in rooms she had tidied. She moved through the house like an archaeologist, cataloging artifacts of a dead civilization. But I was not dead. I was watching. I was remembering. I was preparing. The night before her next scheduled visit, I sat in the armchair by the window and watched the rain blur the streetlights outside. My reflection stared back from the glass, lined, pale, but steady. I thought of my husband again, of how he used to say, "You can't stop a storm by shouting at it, but you can decide which way you'll face it." I poured myself a small glass of sherry, opened my notebook, and wrote one more line beneath the others. Tomorrow, I stop waiting for rescue. Then I closed it gently, as if tucking a secret to sleep, and let the night fold over me like a curtain, heavy, but mine to draw back when I chose. The shift came quietly, the way most revolutions do, not with shouting or broken glass, but in the hush of a morning when the mind simply refuses to be frightened anymore. I woke early that day, before the mail truck came, before Claire could arrive with another batch of papers, and the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if it had been holding its breath and was finally ready to exhale. For weeks I had been waiting for someone to see me, to recognize what was being done, to stop this slow erasure wrapped in the language of care. But the realization arrived, slow and unsentimental. No one was coming. The rescue I'd been waiting for would have to come from my own 2 hands. There is something clarifying about the moment a woman decides she has been cornered for the last time. It doesn't roar. It hums low in the bones, steady and irreversible. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer where I'd hidden the folder of documents they didn't know I still possessed. the power of attorney draft, unsigned. The account statements, the property deed in my name alone, the old insurance files, each page a small anchor of fact against the tide of their fiction. I smoothed them out and read every word. For the first time in months, I felt something close to calm. After breakfast, I dressed with unusual care, choosing the navy coat I'd worn to my husband's memorial, the one that made me look like I knew what I was doing even when I didn't. I caught the bus to town, sat by the window, and watched the city pass in its indifferent rhythm. The bank was my first stop. I had called ahead to ask for an appointment, pretending confusion, playing the part they had assigned me. The young woman at the desk greeted me with professional warmth and the slightly raised eyebrows of someone expecting trouble. "How can I help you today, Mrs. Pierce?" she asked. I handed her my identification, leaned forward, and in the same tone I used to use on misbehaving students, said, "I'd like to review all joint account authorizations and recent transfers, and I'd like copies of every document with my name attached." She hesitated, probably expecting the usual fog of old age, but when I didn't blink, she nodded and began typing. I watched her face as the screen lit up. Her expression shifted just slightly when she saw the list of transactions. "It appears," she said carefully, "that your daughter has been helping manage some of your finances." "Helping?" I repeated. "That's one word for it. I signed the forms to revoke her access, changed the passwords, and arranged for new cards to be sent to a post office box I opened that same morning." When the woman handed me the confirmation slips, I could almost feel the air loosen around me. Paperwork, I thought, is just another form of war. And today I'd won a small battle. From the bank, I walked to the law office 2 blocks down, the one belonging to an old student of mine named Nathan Gray. He'd been in my class 35 years ago, an awkward boy who wrote essays about honor and justice with too much earnestness for his age. When I called the day before, his secretary had been startled to hear my name. "He still talks about you," she said. "Says you taught him how to argue without losing his soul." I smiled at that. Now, sitting in his polished office surrounded by certificates and tidy shelves, I watched recognition flicker across his face as I explained my situation. He listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the way he must listen to clients who come to him already defeated. When I finished, he leaned back and said softly, "You taught me to pay attention to the verbs people use. Your daughter's been using the wrong ones. You don't need permission, Mrs. Pierce. You need a notary." We went through every document together. He drafted a statement revoking the power of attorney and filed notice of unauthorized transactions. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "If you'd like, we can also set up a living trust. Something that keeps your decisions yours, no matter who tries to interfere." I looked out the window at the slow drift of pedestrians below and said, "Yes, I think I'd like that very much." When I left his office, the city felt brighter, sharper. The anxiety that had been gnawing at me for weeks was replaced by a clean, fierce clarity. I walked to a cafe near the square, ordered soup, and sat by the window, watching the world carry on as if nothing had changed, when in truth, everything had. The sun slipped between the clouds, gilding the tops of cars and windows, and for a brief, unguarded moment, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I realized how long it had been since I'd made a decision that was purely mine, not softened for someone else's comfort or disguised as compromise. Freedom, I discovered, is quieter than I remembered. It doesn't shout or demand applause. It just sits beside you like a companion you'd forgotten you once had. By the time I returned home, the afternoon had thinned into that strange, suspended hour between light and dark. Claire's car was already in the driveway. She was inside, rearranging drawers again, humming to herself, her version of control masquerading as domesticity. When she saw me, she smiled, surprised and faintly irritated. "You've been out," she said. "I tried calling." "I needed some air," I replied. "You should have told me," she said, her tone tightening around the edges. I shrugged. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to breathe." Her eyes narrowed, searching for insolence, but I didn't offer it. Instead, I set my purse on the counter, pulled off my gloves, and began boiling water for tea, as if nothing unusual had happened. She started talking again, her voice smooth and managerial, about the moving company she'd contacted, the schedule for the facility orientation, the deposit she'd finalized. I listened, nodded at the right places, and let her think the current was still moving her way. Later that evening, after she left, I took out the new folder Nathan had given me and placed it where the old one had been, identical in size, but filled with entirely different truths. I looked around the house, at the shadows softening across the walls, and felt the strangest mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel borrowed. I opened the window in the kitchen and let in the cool wind. It carried the scent of wet leaves and distant rain, a reminder that the seasons change regardless of who tries to control them. That night, I sat at the desk and began to write a letter, not to Claire, but to myself. I wrote about the day she was born, about the first time she called me brave, about the slow way love can curdle into obligation when people forget its shape. I wrote that I forgave her fear, but not her arrogance, that I would no longer participate in my own diminishment. The words came steadily, without tremor. I sealed the letter in an envelope and tucked it into the drawer with my husband's wedding band, a small pact between the woman I was and the one I intended to become. In the morning, I woke with the certainty that my life was no longer waiting to be taken from me. It was waiting to be reclaimed. I called Nathan and confirmed the new filings. Then I made another call, this one to the director of Oakview Senior Living. When his assistant answered, chirpy and oblivious, I said, "This is Eleanor Pierce. I'd like to inform you that the reservation under my name is no longer valid. The payment made on my behalf was unauthorized. You may refund my daughter if you wish, though I suspect you'll be waiting a long time." The silence on the line was exquisite. I hung up before she could respond. When Claire arrived that afternoon, I was waiting for her in the living room, calm, composed, and ready. She launched into her usual chatter about timelines and packing, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. When she finally paused, I handed her a single sheet of paper, the legal notice Nathan had prepared. Her eyes scanned it, confusion blooming into disbelief. "What is this?" she asked. "It's the end of your project," I said. She laughed nervously. "You can't just—" "I already have," I interrupted. The firmness in my voice startled even me. For a moment she just stared, her lips parted, her face draining of color. "Mom," she whispered, "I was only trying to help." "I know," I said softly, "and now I'm helping myself." She left without finishing her tea, the sound of the door closing behind her as precise and final as a signature. When the silence returned, I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The lilac bush swayed gently in the wind, defiant as ever. I thought of how many times it had been cut back and how it always grew again, fuller, stronger, impossible to contain. I realized then that survival isn't just endurance, it's strategy. You wait, you plan, you outlive. I made another pot of tea, sat down with my notebook, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I allowed myself to breathe fully. I was not safe, not yet, but I was awake. And sometimes that's the only beginning that matters. A week passed before Claire called again, though I knew from the faint smell of perfume near the front gate that she had been stopping by, standing in the yard, trying to summon the courage to knock. When she finally did appear, it was not with contrition, but with a new tone, carefully measured calm, the kind of voice one reserves for a child or a patient. "Mom," she began, "we should talk about what you did." What I did. The phrasing almost made me laugh. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, where sunlight slipped through the lace curtain in tired stripes, dust motes drifting like witnesses. "You've created a mess," she said. "The accounts, the bank, the lawyer, Mark's furious. Do you even realize how this looks?" I studied her face, the tremor of exhaustion beneath her foundation, the faint crease between her eyebrows that deepened whenever she felt cornered. "It looks," I said finally, "like a woman remembering who she is." She exhaled through her nose, small and sharp, and tapped her nails against the table. "This isn't about pride, it's about safety," she said again, and the words snapped between us like a wire. I poured tea into 2 cups, one for her, one for me, though only mine steamed. She didn't touch hers. "Mom, we're trying to protect you. You don't understand what's at stake." I smiled faintly. "I do. I simply don't agree with you about who needs protection." From that day forward, her visits became less frequent but more strategic. Letters arrived instead, official-looking envelopes bearing her return address, each filled with careful admonitions and copies of documents she hoped would intimidate. They were all meaningless now. Nathan had sealed every loophole she could reach. Still, she persisted. There was a strange inevitability in her persistence, as though she believed that if she could just bury me in enough paper, I would surrender from fatigue. What she didn't know was that I had been grading essays for 3 decades. I could drown in paper and still come up for air. Her last letter before the confrontation contained a single phrase underlined twice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I read it aloud and laughed until the sound startled me. Harder for whom, I wondered. The pressure began to mount in subtler ways. The phone rang with unfamiliar voices asking about property verification. A car idled too long outside on 2 separate nights. The neighbor, Mrs. Givens, mentioned seeing Claire speaking with a man in a suit near the mailbox. Rumors spread faster than truth in small neighborhoods, and soon even the grocer's boy was glancing at me as if I might crumble mid-sentence. Yet through it all, I felt a strange steadiness, as if each act of intrusion only clarified the edges of my resolve. I no longer felt frightened of them. I felt something closer to pity. One afternoon, the doorbell rang while I was trimming the lilac bush. A man in a gray suit stood on the porch, sweating through his collar despite the mild weather. "Mrs. Pierce?" he asked. "My name is Daniel Horvath. I represent your daughter, Mrs. Morgan. I just need a few minutes of your time to clarify some matters." His tone was rehearsed, professional, and faintly patronizing. I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves and stepped aside. "You can have 5 minutes," I said. He smiled thinly and entered, glancing around as though taking inventory. We sat in the living room, the smell of soil still clinging to my sleeves. He began explaining something about concerns regarding my mental competence, phrases like capacity assessment and best interest. My heart did not race. It slowed. "You're suggesting," I said, "that my daughter wants the state to decide whether I'm of sound mind." He hesitated, then nodded once. "It's just a precautionary measure, ma'am. Nothing personal." "Of course," I said, my voice level. "And who signed the request?" He hesitated again. "Your daughter and her husband." I rose without haste and walked to my desk. From the drawer, I pulled out a file and placed it gently on the table between us. "This is a notarized statement from my attorney, confirming my mental competence and legal independence," I said. "This, in fact, supersedes any petition your clients might have filed." He reached for it as if touching something hot. His lips moved soundlessly as he scanned the letterhead. "You'll find," I added, "that any further attempt to question my capacity will be regarded as harassment under state law." I didn't need to raise my voice. The paper did the shouting for me. When he left, his shoes clicked too fast on the pavement. I watched from the window as he walked to his car, already on his phone, probably reporting his failure. I felt the first real rush of triumph in months, not the giddy kind, but the quiet, earned one that comes from outsmarting someone who believed you'd gone soft. That evening, I received a call from Nathan. "They won't stop," he said. "You should be prepared for escalation, legal, maybe even public." I told him I was prepared for worse. He chuckled, weary but impressed. "You always did grade the hardest," he said. "I'll handle the filings. You just keep your head steady." "That," I said, "is the only part of me they can't rewrite." When I hung up, I realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. For the first time in years, I felt alive with purpose. The next few days unfolded like the calm before a storm. I tended the garden, cooked proper meals, opened the windows, and let the house breathe. I knew what was coming. One learns to sense invasion after living through marriage, motherhood, and bureaucracy. On the fourth morning, a large white envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a formal petition for guardianship, Claire's name printed neatly alongside Mark's. It accused me of increasing confusion, reckless financial decisions, and uncooperative behavior. There was even a note citing social isolation and potential self-neglect. I laughed aloud at that last phrase, glancing around at my spotless kitchen, the simmering pot of stew on the stove, the tidy garden outside. They had crafted a fiction so meticulous it almost deserved applause. Almost. Instead of replying, I did something unexpected even to myself. I went to town and booked an appointment with the local paper's community columnist, a woman named Sophie, whom I'd met years earlier when she interviewed retirees about volunteer work. She remembered me instantly. "You wrote that letter about the library closing," she said, shaking my hand. "What can I do for you?" I told her I wanted to write a piece, anonymous, of course, about how easily older people could be stripped of their autonomy by their own families. I framed it as advocacy, not confession. Sophie agreed, intrigued, and within a week my essay appeared under the title The Disappearing Parent: When Concern Becomes Control. It spread faster than I expected, shared on community boards, read aloud at the library book club, whispered about at the farmer's market. I knew Claire would see it eventually. I also knew she'd recognize every word as mine. She called 2 days later, furious, but trying to sound calm. "You humiliated us," she said, her voice brittle. "Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" I answered slowly, "I think you're finding out how it feels to be misrepresented." She tried to guilt me, cried even, but I heard calculation beneath the tears. I'd raised her. I knew the difference between grief and performance. "Mom, I just want things to be easier," she said finally. "You've made this so difficult." I told her, "Difficulty is the first sign of honesty. You should try it more often." The line went silent. She hung up without another word. After that, things shifted again. The newspaper printed a follow-up about elder financial independence, quoting a retired educator who fought back. People in town began greeting me differently, not with pity, but with respect. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped by with small gifts, loaves of bread, jars of jam, as though I had done something heroic rather than merely refused extinction. The support was touching, but also dangerous. Attention draws predators. So I remained careful. I spoke little, smiled often, and kept my new life quietly fortified with paperwork and allies. Then, one evening near dusk, a familiar car pulled up outside. I recognized it before I heard the door slam. Claire emerged not in her usual tailored coat, but in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back. She looked smaller, younger somehow, and she wasn't alone. A man stepped out of the passenger side, Arthur, my late husband's brother, who'd long since drifted from the family. He was holding an envelope. "Ellie," he said gently, "may we come in?" I hesitated, but something in his tone disarmed me. They entered the living room, where the last light of the day cut across the floor in long, golden bars. Claire sat stiffly, Arthur beside her. "I asked Uncle Arthur to come," she said. "I thought maybe he could help us talk." "Talk," I repeated. "You mean negotiate." She flinched. Arthur spoke softly. "She's worried about you, Ellie. She feels you've changed." "I have," I said. "I've remembered what respect feels like." He sighed, looked between us and opened the envelope. "This," he said, "is an offer. They want to make amends, to keep the house in the family. Claire says they'll handle maintenance and expenses if you'll just agree to move into the facility voluntarily. You'd have visitation, full access, comfort." "Prison with privileges," I interrupted. "No." Claire's voice cracked. "Please, Mom, you're being unreasonable." I leaned forward, met her eyes. "Reasonable is what people call you when they want you to agree with them." "I'm done being reasonable." She began to cry in earnest then, real tears this time, the kind that come from losing control. I watched them slide down her face, felt the ache of recognition. She wasn't a monster. She was afraid. Afraid of age, of inheritance, of the mirror I held up to her. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder, helpless. "Let her be," I said. "She'll understand someday." He nodded slowly, then left, guiding her out like someone escorting the wounded. When the door closed, the quiet that followed was not relief, but release. I stood there for a long moment, the fading sun warm on my face, realizing I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That night, I went into my husband's study and unlocked the small wooden box he had once used for correspondence. Inside was the deed to the house and a handwritten note from years ago, for her hands only. Beneath it, another envelope I had never opened, addressed to my Ellie for later. I unfolded the letter with shaking fingers. His handwriting wavered, but was still steady enough to read, "If anyone ever tries to take from you what we built together, remember this. Paper is only powerful if you let it speak louder than truth. You've always been the truth in this house." I read the words twice, then placed the letter back carefully, as though it might break. That was when the idea formed, clear and whole, like something that had been waiting in the dark for permission to breathe. The next morning, I called Nathan again. "I want to make one more change," I said. "To the trust." He listened, surprised but supportive, as I outlined what I wanted. The house would no longer be mine to give, sell, or lose. It would belong to a foundation for women over 60 starting new lives after displacement. "You'll give your home away?" he asked quietly. "I'll give it purpose," I replied. He paused, then said, "You really are teaching until the end." I smiled. "I've just changed classrooms." By the time the papers were drafted, signed, and sealed, I felt lighter than I had in years. When the courier came to deliver the finalized trust documents, I watched him walk down the path, the lilac bush swaying beside him, and thought of Claire reading the notice someday. She would see that the house she'd tried to claim had already moved beyond her reach. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it to end the war she'd started, to make it impossible for her to ever fight me again. And in that act, something inside me, something old and fierce and once silenced, rose to the surface and stayed there, steady as breath. The day of the reckoning arrived disguised as an ordinary Sunday, the kind of morning when sunlight seeps gently through curtains and makes even old furniture look forgiving. I remember the smell of coffee, the distant hum of lawnmowers, the quiet composure of a world that had no idea something irreversible was about to unfold. I had been awake since dawn, moving through the house with the deliberate patience of someone saying goodbye, not out of grief, but out of completion. Every object had a weight, a story, a shadow of belonging. The photograph of my husband in his Navy uniform, the cracked teacup with its stubborn chip, the faded rug where my children once played. These things no longer clung to me as burdens. They stood like witnesses. I had prepared for this moment not with rage, but with precision. By the time Claire's car appeared at the end of the driveway, white and gleaming in the sun, I had already placed the envelope on the table. I had brewed a fresh pot of tea and arranged 2 cups, though I suspected one would remain untouched. I was not nervous. The air itself seemed to hold still, as though waiting for the page to turn. Claire entered without knocking, the way she used to when she still believed this house belonged partly to her. She was dressed too neatly for a casual visit. Navy slacks, a silk blouse, the kind of outfit people wear when they're about to deliver news they want to sound official. "Mom," she began, her voice already tight around the edges, "we need to have a serious conversation." I gestured toward the table, to the tea steaming softly between us. "Then sit," I said. She hesitated, but obeyed, lowering herself into the chair like someone bracing for turbulence. "I know what you've done," she said, eyes narrowing. "The trust, the deed, all of it." Mark spoke to the lawyer. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The tense jaw, the trembling fingers gripping the edge of the chair, the familiar rhythm of someone trying to disguise fear as authority. "No, Claire," I said calmly. "I haven't caused trouble. I've ended it." She laughed then, a brittle, incredulous sound that didn't reach her eyes. You've given away your own house to strangers, to some ridiculous charity. Are you completely out of your mind? The words stung less than I expected. I had grown accustomed to the way she weaponized care, how she wrapped her insults in the language of concern. I poured her tea slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. It's not a charity, I said. It's a continuation. You wanted to place me in a facility where people disappear. I've created a place where women like me can reappear. She blinked, as though she hadn't understood the sentence, then shook her head sharply. You can't just erase us from your life, Mom. We're your family. I met her gaze and said, You should have remembered that before you tried to erase me from mine. Her voice rose, sharp and cracking. I was trying to protect you. You don't know what it's like, worrying every day if you'll fall, if you'll forget to lock the door, if someone will take advantage of you. I leaned forward, my tone still measured. I know exactly what it's like. I've been living it. With you. That silenced her. For the first time since this began, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. She looked at me as though seeing a stranger in her mother's skin, someone she couldn't manipulate with guilt or affection. I realized then that the power had shifted entirely. Her authority depended on my compliance, and I had withdrawn it without ceremony. Do you even understand what this means for me? She whispered finally, her voice breaking on the last word. There's nothing left. The inheritance, the property. It's gone. After everything I've done. She stopped, realizing too late that her confession had already formed. I sat back, letting the words settle. After everything you've done, I repeated softly. Exactly. Her face flushed with a kind of panic I recognized from my own reflection years ago. The moment when denial collapses and truth takes its place like an uninvited guest. She stood abruptly, pacing the room, her footsteps sharp on the old wood floor. You've humiliated me, she said. Everyone will know. The family, Mark, the community. You've made me look like a villain. I shook my head. You made yourself one. I just stopped playing your script. For a long time, she said nothing. The silence between us thickened until even the clock seemed hesitant to tick. Then she turned, eyes glistening, and asked the question that every betrayer eventually asks when the mirror no longer flatters them. Why couldn't you just let us help? I sighed. Because help that demands obedience isn't help, it's ownership. She sat back down slowly, as though her body had lost all its arguments. The anger drained from her face, replaced by something far sadder, bewilderment, perhaps even regret. For a moment, she was the child I remembered, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and whisper, "Don't let go, Mommy." I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but I knew the gesture would confuse mercy for forgiveness, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said finally, voice trembling. I just wanted to feel safe, to know everything was controlled. Control, I said gently, is the opposite of safety. It's just fear wearing a clean dress. She looked down, tears slipping silently onto her lap. The sight broke something in me that I hadn't realized was still intact. I felt no triumph, only an immense quiet sorrow for her, for me, for all the women who are taught to confuse love with possession. I wanted her to understand, not to suffer. But understanding requires humility, and humility is a language she'd never learned to speak fluently. When she finally stood, her movements were slow, almost reverent. "So that's it then," she said. "You've chosen strangers over your own daughter." "No," I replied. "I've chosen myself. You should try it sometime." She flinched, turned away, and walked toward the door. Before she reached it, I said, "Claire." She stopped, shoulders tense. "The house isn't yours," I said quietly. "But you're welcome to visit. As my daughter. Not as my keeper." She didn't look back. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a chapter ending. For a while, I stood there, feeling this strange stillness that follows any confrontation where too much truth has been spoken. The house felt different now, wider somehow, as if its walls had exhaled. I walked through each room slowly, touching the surfaces that had borne witness to the storm. In the living room, a ray of sunlight fell directly on the table where the legal documents lay, their embossed seals catching the light like medals after a long battle. It wasn't victory I felt, but restoration. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was simply standing in the home that was once again entirely mine. Later that evening, when the sun had dipped low and the windows reflected the amber glow of dusk, I brewed another pot of tea and sat by the window. The lilac bush outside swayed gently, its blossoms heavy and fragrant. It had weathered pruning, neglect, frost, and yet here it was, blooming again. I thought of Claire, of the child she had been, and the woman she had become, and I whispered a silent hope into the fading light, that one day she would understand that strength and control are not the same thing, that love without respect rots into something poisonous. I sat there until the first stars appeared, small and deliberate against the darkening sky. In that quiet, I realized how much of my life had been spent shrinking to make others comfortable, apologizing for existing too loudly, too independently, too persistently. No more. The papers on the table were not just legal instruments. They were the architecture of my reclamation. They said in ink what I had finally said aloud: "I am not yours to manage." When the clock struck 9, I rose, turned off the lights, and walked through the house one last time before bed. In the study, I paused before my husband's photograph. "It's done," I whispered. "You'd have been proud of me, I think." In my mind, I heard his dry chuckle, the one that used to follow every time I corrected a banker or argued with a school board member. I smiled, feeling him there, not as a ghost, but as a companion to my solitude. I went to bed that night with the windows open and slept without dreams, the way one does when the worst has already been said and survived. In the morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the smell of wet earth. Rain had fallen in the night, soft but thorough, washing the dust from the air. I stood at the window, watching the garden shimmer, and felt the kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances but on clarity. I had thought revenge would feel sweet, but it didn't. What I felt was cleaner than that, like a truth restored to its rightful owner. The war was over. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was freedom taking shape. I sat down at my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote a single line beneath all the others. When they tried to move me out, they only moved me back into myself. Then I closed it gently and let the morning light spill across the page, steady and merciful, like a benediction. The weeks that followed unfolded with the strange stillness of an aftershock, a quiet so deep that even the walls seemed to listen. There was no more mail from Claire, no phone calls, no lawyer's letters left like little threats disguised as courtesy. The silence she left behind was not cruel. It was hollow, unfinished. The kind of silence that waits for a softer ending, but knows it may never come. The house, however, began to breathe again. The air lost that tension that had clung to it for months, the sense that everything was on the verge of being boxed up and erased. Each morning, I woke to the sound of my own footsteps instead of strangers' voices, to birdsong instead of bureaucratic chatter. I began to move differently, not cautiously as before, but deliberately, as if reacquainting myself with the dimensions of my own life. Freedom, I discovered, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It settles in quietly, asking only to be noticed. The first Sunday after she left, I took the bus into town. I hadn't done that in years, always letting her drive me or ordering groceries online when she insisted it was safer. But I wanted to feel the small discomforts again, the jostle of strangers, the hum of the engine, the scent of coffee drifting from open cups. I sat by the window and watched the city pass, a collage of movement and small kindnesses. A man holding a door for an elderly woman, a child pressing her nose against the glass of a bakery. The ordinary mercies that fill the spaces between our catastrophes. When the bus stopped near the square, I stepped out and walked toward the library, the same one where I had taught evening literacy classes years ago. The librarian, a young man with kind eyes and ink stains on his fingers, recognized my name from the donation papers. He showed me where they'd hung the plaque, the Eleanor Pierce Center for Women's Learning. It was small, elegant, mounted beside the entrance. I traced the letters lightly with my fingers, feeling something deep and steady rise in my chest. Not pride, exactly, but a kind of reconciliation. My life, once nearly traded away for convenience, now had a new address. Inside, the space was still being prepared. A handful of volunteers, most of them women with tired eyes and resolute hands, were unpacking boxes of books and setting up tables. One of them, a gray-haired woman named Marjorie, introduced herself and said she'd left her husband after 40 years and didn't quite know where to begin again. "Then you've come to the right place," I said. We talked while we worked, sorting through donations and arranging shelves. I realized that what I had built was not a sanctuary for the forgotten, as I'd first imagined, but a gathering place for the resilient. Women who had survived erasure in all its forms and were now learning, like me, to inhabit their own names again. The sound of their laughter, the rustle of pages, the murmur of shared stories. It filled the space like light. For the first time in months, I felt part of something larger than survival. When I returned home that evening, the house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, waiting. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the sky bruise into twilight. A letter lay on the doorstep when I opened the door to bring in the milk. It was from Claire. No envelope, just a folded sheet of paper written in her familiar slanted script. "Mom," it began. I don't know what to say. I was angry, but mostly I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of becoming you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you'll let me visit someday. I want to understand what you've done. Maybe I need to. I read it twice, then placed it on the table beside the teapot. There was no need to answer immediately. Some bridges take time to rebuild, and not all of them should lead back to the same place. But I smiled, faintly, because the letter's tone was different. Not demanding, not defensive, but searching. That was enough. Understanding, like forgiveness, begins with curiosity. In the following days, I began to write again. Not the terse notes of resistance I'd kept in my hidden ledger, but reflections, memories, small essays about the ordinary injustices that shape women's lives. I wrote about the way kindness can suffocate, how love can blur into control, how invisibility isn't silence, but exhaustion. Each page felt like a reclamation of language that had once been used against me. I wrote late into the night, sometimes until the first hint of dawn brushed the curtains. It wasn't catharsis I was after, but clarity. I wanted to leave behind a record, not of what they did to me, but of what I refused to let them do. The house continued its slow transformation. The boxes that once held the past now held donations for the center. Books, linens, framed prints, and photographs of women who had come through worse storms than mine. The lilac bush outside bloomed again, richer than ever, its scent carrying through the open windows. Children from the neighborhood sometimes came to pick the flowers, leaving small gaps in the branches. I didn't stop them. I liked the thought of pieces of this place traveling out into the world, spreading the story in ways no newspaper could. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined Claire standing outside the gate, uncertain whether to knock. I didn't picture confrontation or apology, just her face softened by time and understanding. I hoped that someday she would realize I hadn't punished her. I had taught her something she was not yet ready to learn, that love must be wide enough to include respect, and respect must be strong enough to survive disagreement. Perhaps years from now, she would visit the center and see the women there reading, laughing, rebuilding, and she would understand that this was her inheritance after all, not a house, but a lesson. One evening, as the first chill of autumn settled in, I sat with my tea and wrote a final letter, not to Claire, but to any woman who might one day sit where I was sitting, feeling the slow suffocation of being managed out of her own life. I wrote, "You are not fragile. They only tell you that so you'll stop lifting. You are not finished. They only say that because your strength frightens them. When they call it love, but it feels like shrinking, trust the feeling, not the word." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer in the study, beside my husband's old pen. It was not meant to be found immediately. It was meant to wait, like wisdom often does, until someone was ready to receive it. On the day the community center officially opened, I stood in front of the crowd, a small group of volunteers, journalists, and women from the neighborhood. I spoke briefly, because speeches had never been my way of commanding attention. "This isn't a monument," I said. "It's a beginning. Every woman here has a story she was told to keep quiet. This place exists so that silence can become voice." They applauded, some smiling through tears. I looked out at them and felt an odd, serene gratitude for everything that had happened, even the betrayal. Without it, I might have drifted quietly into the oblivion they'd planned for me. Instead, I had built something that would outlive me, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. That night, after the guests left and the lights were turned off, I sat alone in the empty hall. The air smelled faintly of paper and new paint. I thought of all the women who would pass through those doors, women whose names I'd never know, who would sit at those tables and begin their own small revolutions. The idea filled me with peace deeper than victory, the kind that asks for nothing more than endurance. When I returned home, the moonlight poured across the floor like water, soft and familiar. I stood at the window looking at the lilacs swaying in the dark and whispered, "They thought they were moving me out. I was moving on." The words didn't sound like defiance anymore. They sounded like prayer. And in that still silver light, I finally understood what freedom really means. It isn't the absence of walls, but the certainty that none of them can hold you.